Welcome, everyone. I'm honored to speak today with my colleagues, to partner with my colleagues, Senator Leahy, Senator Tester, Senator Sanders, Senator Blumenthal, to talk about the importance of providing the American people with clear, easily understandable information about the foods they and their families eat every day. All of us steadfastly believe in the simple truth that all Americans have the right to know what is in their food. They have the right to know whether the food is GMO, genetically modified, or contains ingredients that are derived from GMO crops. Consumers across the country share this perspective. In fact, this is one of those issues that Democrats, Republicans, and independents all agree on. 9 out of 10 Americans believe that they should have a simple, easy to read indication on a package whether food is GMO or not. Isn't it ironic that here, when it is so rare to find something that Democrats, Republicans, and independents all agree on, we're about to consider a bill on the floor that completely goes counter to what these American citizens want. They particularly like their ingredient labels, that they can pick up a product and turn it over and easily look at it and see in a moment, really in just 1 second, the number of calories that it has, or whether it contains peanuts, or whether it includes any other ingredient they might be concerned about. And they would like to have that same simple information on whether or not food is GMO. This has become the standard across the world. 64 other countries, including all 28 members of the European Union, Japan, Australia, Brazil, even China requires mandatory GMO labeling. Unfortunately, the bill that is coming to the floor, which I'll refer to as the Monsanto Dark Act 2.0, does not provide this basic information. Now, the DARK Act is an acronym. It stands for Deny Americans the Right to Know. So here is a so-called mandatory labeling bill, but in fact, it does the opposite. It denies Americans the right to know. This so-called mandatory GMO labeling bill isn't mandatory, doesn't label, and it excludes most GMO foods. Now, I know that my colleague, Senator Stabenow, has worked hard to try to find a bill that would achieve the vision that consumers reach for. But because of the stubbornness and the power of the lobby, we haven't been able to get that bill. So I appreciate her efforts. But it's important that we understand how this bill falls short. The first loophole is it doesn't establish a national standard for bioengineered foods. In fact, it explicitly includes language as a definition of GMO that isn't used anywhere else in the world. That definition means that corn oil derived from Monsanto GMO corn isn't GMO for purposes of this bill. It means that soybean oil derived from Monsanto soy crop is not GMO for purposes of this bill. It means that sugar derived from Monsanto GMO sugar beets is not GMO for purposes of this bill. Thus, the main GMO crops in America are not GMO, magically, through the definition utilized in this bill. The second substantial loophole is that it doesn't provide a labeling standard that is one that actually labels GMO foods. It gives companies permission to use a label that says GMO, but of course they have that permission right now, so that doesn't change anything. But what it uses as the default is a QR code. Now, if anyone can read this code and tell me if there are GMO ingredients in this product, then you really deserve a genius prize. Because no one I know, no matter how smart they are, can read this and say whether or not there are GMO ingredients in this product. Instead, it sets up an impossible obstacle course for consumers who want to know. That obstacle course means that you have to have a smartphone. You have to be able to scan this code. You have to have a digital plan that you're paying information for. You have to have wireless in the store when you are at this. And you have to take a lot of time to go to a website to find out the answer. Are there GMO ingredients in this food? It is absolutely clear that no consumer who could compare with a normal label 5 products in 5 seconds to see if they contain GMO ingredients, it would take them half an hour to compare 5 products with this code. This obstacle course does not meet the standard of providing a GMO label. The third big problem with the bill is there is no enforcement in this bill. The bill's language says that the Secretary of Agriculture, and I quote, shall have no authority to recall any food subject to the subtitle on the basis of whether the food bears a disclosure that the food is bioengineered. If furthermore, the bill provides absolutely no ability to exercise a fine of any kind. What the bill does say is that USDA could do an investigation based on a complaint to look into whether or not a company is abiding by this law, and if they find that there is a valid basis, they can publish the results of their investigation. They can make it known. So they can simply say, yes, such and such a company isn't labeling in accordance with this law. And of course, that's not much of a penalty, because it'll be transparent to any consumer that there isn't a GMO label standard anyway. So these are simply 3 major loopholes in this bill. We have a definition that doesn't include the major GMO products. We do not have a GMO label of any kind required that any ordinary person could detect. It's an obstacle course for consumers, and there's no enforcement power. Now, my colleagues are going to point out other pieces of this bill that are really unacceptable. But the bottom line is consumers have a right to know what's in their food. If we're going to take away a state right to provide that information, we should absolutely have a powerful federal standard. This bill does not give that to us, and with that, I'm so delighted to introduce, we're going, you need to go, are you going? Senator Leahy is going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's sort of the Groundhog Day. Many of you, here we are doing this again. Many of you might not know, but the thing that first precipitated this was because the Vermont legislature spent 2 years conducting over 50 committee hearings with over 130 witnesses testifying on all sides of the issue before it enacted was known as Act 120, a true mandatory disclosure act for genetically engineered food, which got the lobbyists and others to come up first with the Dark Act, which we stopped. But now this has become their big priority, because the lobbyists said, just think of all the things the Senate should be doing. But apparently a consumer's right to know, your right to know, my right to know, what we're eating, what we're feeding our families, is, as far as the leadership is concerned, is more threatening to our country than gun violence. Apparently, thwarting a consumer's right to know is more pressing than bringing up criminal justice reform. Apparently, this is more urgent and more time sensitive than national security legislation. Well, come on. The bottom line is there are companies already doing this. You can pick up a can, or you can pick up a package and know in simple language with some companies. But those that aren't can. It's as simple as that. When you wonder why lobbyists and a company will spend tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars to lobby against a simple label. It doesn't say you can't buy it, but it just says you ought to know what you're getting. Just as we do, if somebody has a gluten allergy or a peanut allergy, you can look at it and know what it is. But now the Senate wants to throw out the work Vermont's done. The record is complied, say we know better. Well, instead of using Vermont's law as a floor, they just want to throw this out entirely and create more confusion for consumers across the country. Well, Vermont didn't send me here to be silent. In fact, Vermont tends not to send senators to the Senate to be silent. So I'm going to be joining with Senator Merkley, and Senator Sanders, and Senator Tester, and Senator Blumenthal, saying, wait a minute, let's have this debate. You don't have time to do important things, but you have time to do a lobbyist bidding. Well, come on. We're going to say, have a debate. Maybe an improvement on the Dark Act, which we wisely defeated in March. And I was glad to be staying on there on the floor to defeat it. But it's not enough. It could be better. It should be better. And if it's not better, it should not pass. It's as simple as that. And Senator Tester.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And Patrick, thank you for your leadership over the years, whether it was the guy who sponsored the Organic Act in the 90s or the leadership on this issue. Look, you all know I'm a farmer, probably the only actively engaged farmer in the United States Senate. This issue is near and dear to my heart. I was always raised with the thought, my parents always told me the customer's king. What the customer wants is what you deliver to them, and you will be successful if you're able to do that. What the customers want in the United States of America, 9 out of 10, is they want their food labeled. So what did the Senate do? We developed a Mickey Mouse QR label where working families in this country will have to take an iPhone, take a picture of it, go to a website, sort through that website till you find the information you need. And that's if you have an iPhone, and that's if the store has Wi-Fi. And we're going to call that a labeling bill for genetically modified food. Food, the most important thing that we do to our body. If you eat the right food, it reduces inflammation. If you eat the right food, you don't have to take a bunch of supplements. If you eat the right food, you are healthier. That is a fact. And we are going to deny consumers with this bill the right to know what they're buying. That's not why the people sent us here, and that's why we have single-digit approval ratings in the United States Senate. When we think that we know more than the consumer, this is the kind of legislation that we get. So from a labeling standpoint, this bill falls woefully short of meeting what the American public deserves. And as pointed out by Senator Merkley, places like Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, I believe 61 other countries, other than 64 in total, have labeling, not places that you particularly think they have great transparency. I'll say a couple other things. First of all, the definition is seriously flawed. It takes one technique of gene modification. There are 4 that I know of right now, and it doesn't address those at all. And tomorrow there will be other methods of gene modification that they don't address. Which brings you to the question, why would you change a definition for this bill? Why would you change that if it wasn't in somebody's best interest? And it's not in the consumer's best interest, I will just tell you. And the last thing I will say is this. People tout the fact that this helps the organic industry. Look, all it says is what the organic industry already has. We have the right to label our food. Patrick Leahy did that over 20 years ago. And so to stand up and say this makes the organic industry better, no. What this does is it brings the people out that want to make organic less than it is, and actually gives them the ability through the courts to do that. So it'd be great to have a good labeling bill up. It'd be great to have a labeling bill that would actually allow the consumers to know what they're eating. Those consumers that are concerned about it could pay attention to it. Those consumers that aren't could buy whatever they wanted. Doesn't matter. But instead, we're going to pass a piece of legislation that, quite frankly, Mickey Mouse wouldn't even be proud of. Next up, we have Bernie Sanders.
Let me thank and agree with everything that Senator Merkley, Senator Leahy, and Senator Tester said, and I'm sure I'll be in agreement with Senator Blumenthal as well. This is not a complicated issue. The American people have a right to know what they're eating. We must adopt meaningful federal GMO labeling standards. This legislation, the Robert Stabenow bill, certainly is not that. This is not a radical idea, as you have heard. Some 64 countries all over the world provide their consumers with the opportunity to know whether they're eating food with GMO modified organisms. Not a radical idea. This is an idea, as John Tester just mentioned and Senator Leahy mentioned, that the American people want. And that is why states like Vermont, Maine, Connecticut, and Alaska have adopted laws to label foods containing GMOs, and why many other states are interested and on the path to doing that. That is also why many environmental groups, including the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, the Environmental Working Group, and many, many other organizations oppose the Roberts-Stabenow bill because they believe in real GMO labeling. Importantly, and Senator Leahy made this point, the Roberts-Stabenow bill will preempt the strong GMO labeling that went into effect in Vermont a few days ago on July 1st. And it will also undermine the efforts of other states to label GMOs. So the timing of this legislation is not an accident. What its goal is to overturn, to rescind the very significant legislation passed in the state of Vermont. The Roberts-Stabenow bill is also absolutely unnecessary. As a result of Vermont's law, many major companies are already labeling their products in 50 states in this nation. And let me repeat that. As a result of Vermont's law, companies all over this country, some of the largest companies in the nation, are already complying. And guess what? These companies started labeling their GMO foods, and the sky didn't fall. It was not a big deal for them. The Roberts-Stabenow bill contains numerous loopholes and is totally ineffective in terms of addressing the needs of the American people who want to know what is in the food they consume. According to the FDA, this bill contains gaping loopholes for many of the most widely used GMO foods and ingredients like soybean oil, sugar from GMO sugar beets, high fructose corn syrup, and GMO salmon and other fish. This bill is inherently flawed because it allows manufacturers to use a digital QR code, which is confusing to consumers. And in the grocery store that my family shops, the internet reception is not all that great. It would not benefit us, and I suspect tens of other millions of consumers around this country. This bill also allows the USDA to choose what percentage of GMOs are present in a product before it must be labeled, putting it at odds with the European Union and the Vermont standards, which are both 0.9%. So this is a bad bill for a number of reasons. It is very much an anti-consumer bill, and I will do everything that I can to see that it's defeated. Senator Blumenthal?
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Sanders, and to my other colleagues who have been such great champions on this issue. Let me just make a couple of quick points. Connecticut has a special stake in this legislation because we have a GMO labeling law that would, in effect, be overridden and subjugated by this measure. This so-called labeling law is an affront and insult to the people of Connecticut, who decided they want real labeling, not a cartoon-like law. And the image of Mickey Mouse evokes for me Old MacDonald, who had a farm, and who I think, even as a cartoon character, would have been affronted by this law. There are grave defects in this law, the lack of a clear and stringent standard for labeling, the lack of enforcement, the lack of transparency. There is nobody who can look at that barcode and know what it means without internet connection, smartphone, and familiarity with how a smartphone can elicit that information and the time to actually get that information in that way, rather than just picking up the carton or the package and knowing what it means. And finally, let me just stress that this law actually puts the United States behind 64 other countries that have meaningful standards for GMO labeling. Never before would the United States have been so far behind on consumer protection where food is concerned than on this measure, behind other countries that we rarely seek to emulate when it comes to consumer protection. It is anti-consumer, it is a step backward, and it precludes states like Connecticut from protecting consumers. It's not just that it is inadequate, it also preempts laws that are on the books right now, laws that would go into effect, like Connecticut's, where a sufficient number of states join in this effort. And so I will be working hard with my colleagues to oppose this measure, and I hope we will prevail.
So, any questions? Yes, sir.
There's a letter that a bunch of Nobel laureates wrote complaining about the opposition to GMOs generally, and their complaint is that there is no science that says these are unsafe, there's no science that they're bad for the planet or people, and on the other side, there is evidence that they help people avoid disease and with malnutrition. So could you just sort of address why you would need the labeling when you've got some very renowned scientists saying you don't really need it?
Absolutely. It goes back to the consumer right to know. Often there's an emphasis put on what goes into your mouth, the healthiness of that. And there certainly is evidence that the glyphosate has been ruled by some international bodies to be a potential carcinogen. There are trace elements of glyphosate that are in people's urine in areas where it's applied, so it's a legitimate concern. But for many people, it's a question about the environmental impacts. The glyphosate, that's the weed killer, and these crops have been modified genetically so that they are resistant to it, has produced an enormous amount. If over the last 15 years, the amount of weed killer that runs into our streams is profound. It's had and so it changes the biology of the streams. That's why so many environmental groups consider this to be an environmental issue. We also have had a big impact on the Midwest monarch butterflies because of the application of this weed killer changing the dynamic, and many people in this country are concerned about the decimation of the monarchs. So there are many different pieces where consumers have a legitimate concern, and it's their right to decide. It's their right to decide what they put into the mouths of their family, into the mouths of their children, and what they buy in terms of the ecological impact. And so we can continue to have a debate over the healthiness. As I said, there is some evidence of some concerns. There's a lot of environmental concerns, but fundamentally it's the consumer right to make the decision, not for some big corporation to make that decision for them by passing a bill that denies Americans the right to know.
And I think that's a really important question. Let me just speak for myself. My urging that we adopt better disclosure, more transparency, serving that right to know is in no way to demean the potential good points about GMO use. I'm not saying that GMOs are unsafe or unhealthy, simply that consumers have a right to make their own judgment based on the kind of science that Nobel laureates and others even less expert may offer. As one of our former colleagues liked to say, Senator Moynihan, everybody's entitled to your own opinion. You're just not entitled to your own facts. What this labeling is designed to do is give people facts. They can form their own opinions, and they can decide that there's nothing wrong with GMOs. Indeed, they want to buy products that have that label. That's a judgment they can reach given the facts and the information.
Yes, sir.
Go back to sugar beets for a moment, if you would. Is that not a matter of interpretation? Has anyone at the USDA told you that they believe that would be exempt?
I invite you to actually read the language of the bill. It refers to consider a GMO ingredient. It has to have genetic material in the product. That material is stripped out. In fact, we have a quote from an interview with sugar beet growers emphasizing the fact that genetic material is stripped out. We have technical advisory from the FDA we'd be happy to provide you with a copy of, which says this definition is problematic and would exclude the derivatives where the genetic information has been stripped out. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you're aware of the correspondence between Senator Stabenow and the USDA General Counsel, I believe it was last week, about, she was raising the questions that FDA had said were the loopholes that critics claim are excluded. There's foods that aren't included in the language, the definition of GMO in the bill. So in the correspondence from USDA, it was an attempt to reassure, I believe, critics that USDA actually has the authority to include those foods. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, the plain language of the bill is the operating factor. It uses a definition used nowhere else in the world. I ask you, why is this definition being used that is different than anyone else in the world? Why does it say there has to be genetic material in the actual ingredient? Well, one thing we know is that Monsanto's main 3 crops produce derivatives that do not have genetic information. This clause appears to be one that would make Monsanto jump for joy. We have the sugar beet growers talking about how their sugar doesn't contain that information. We have the FDA's advisory. There's nothing in this bill contrary to the plain language that says FDA has the power to, notwithstanding the language of the bill, to include things that don't contain genetically modified material.
Last question.
Yep.
I kind of want to go back to this issue. I mean, the General Counsel is very clear in that letter that it does intend to regulate all of these things, and that letter is now part of the congressional record that goes into this bill. So when this gets to rulemaking, and Senator Tester seemed to imply that this thing would pass, like, that will be taken into account. I mean, so this, you're taking a letter from FDA and comparing it to a letter from USDA, but USDA is the implementing authority. I mean, so can you more clearly respond to that? And on top of that, again, Senator Tester really did imply that this thing was going to pass. Is it going to? Do they have the 60 votes for cloture? Is this kind of a done deal?
Well, let me deal with the first question, and then Senator Markey can deal with both questions. For myself, I'm sorry, Senator Merkley. I personally don't know whether it will pass. We're working very hard speaking to our colleagues, and I'm hopeful that they will, in effect, heed and hear their own constituents. The overwhelming number of people across the nation want this information. But on the points about these letters, a court interpreting the issues that will be raised in litigation, no question there'll be litigation, will look first and probably only to the language of the statute. That's a law of statutory rule of statutory interpretation. If the plain language of the statute is clear, there is no reason, in fact, no permission, no allowance to look beyond it. So whatever the general counsel of any agency think, and in fact, no matter what we think individually, and whatever we say on the floor of the Senate, it's the language of the statute that is determinative. And that's why all of these letters, for whatever they say, are going to be irrelevant to a court interpreting this statute.
Let me just emphasize that there's lots of conflicting interpretations, but in this case we have extremely clear language. If the proponents of this bill wanted to include those products that I've referred to, those 3 huge Monsanto crops of corn and soybeans and sugar in terms of soybean oil, high fructose corn syrup, and sugar, then we could simply add an amendment of that nature. I have prepared one. I would invite the proponents to make sure that we get full opportunity to have that amendment voted on. I would expect all of the proponents of this bill to vote for that amendment if they truly believe that they were not creating a loophole. And we have to understand here that USDA is not an impartial actor. They have been a huge proponent of eviscerating a simple, clear labeling standard. They are a major proponent of the QR code, which does not enable a consumer any practical way to answer the fundamental question. The goal is to deny Americans the right to know. The USDA is a full partner in that vision. It is the wrong vision for Americans. It's out of sync with where 9 of 10 Americans stand, regardless of their party. And if we want a clear answer to your question, then the proponents should say yes to an amendment that clearly uses a definition that addresses all the derivatives from GMO crops. Thank you all very much. Do
Thank
you want
you.
to add any lesson?
Well, just to finish on one point, this bill in some ways epitomizes what people most detest. It obfuscates and it obstructs. It obfuscates information that people genuinely want. It obstructs other laws that give them what they want. So it's actually a step backward, not a step forward for states like Connecticut, where we have laws that could provide this information. It's not to ban GMOs. It's not to preclude their use. It's simply to provide information. Thank you.
all very much.